Hey, give me that bag, you old woman.
Come on, don't play dumb. Hand it over. That bag isn't yours anymore.
Move faster, old lady. We don't have all night.
Please, it's all I have.
October 2019, an ordinary morning in the United States. A neighborhood market opened its doors like any other day. People came in, greeted the cashier, and went about their routine. Nothing indicated that a few hours later, that simple place would become the setting for a story that no one has ever fully told. Today, you're going to hear a story that began with silence, went through humiliation, and ended in a way that nobody, absolutely nobody, was prepared to see. There's a moment in this video where everything seems lost, and that's exactly when something happens. We won't reveal what. Just know, when the truth comes out, there's no going back. Hello, welcome to this video about untold stories of Jesus. Stories that aren't in the newspapers, don't appear in statistics, but leave deep marks on those who witness them. Before continuing, I invite you to do something simple but powerful. Write Amen in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from and the exact time now. Leave a like, because that helps this message reach more people. Take a deep breath. Pay attention to the details, because sometimes Jesus doesn't arrive with a bang. He observes in silence until the right moment. It was a typical autumn morning in the southern United States, one of those where the sky remains gray for hours, as if the day was still deciding whether it was worth beginning. The small neighborhood market, squeezed between a laundromat and a pawn shop, opened its doors at 6 o'clock sharp. At 6:03, the nun was already there. Sister Margaret, as everyone knew her, walked slowly down the dairy aisle, pushing an old cart that creaked with every movement. She wore the same simple habit as always: worn fabric, modest shoes, delicate hands marked by time. Anyone who saw her would imagine nothing more than a lifetime of silence, prayer, and service. She greeted the cashier by name, asked about the employees' families, and carefully separated coins before paying. To the neighborhood, she was simply the nun from the market. What no one noticed was the invisible weight she carried in her gaze. In that market, everyone knew each other. The owners, the regular customers, the workers. But in recent months, something had changed. A different kind of presence had begun to circulate through the aisles. Heavy, oppressive, silent. Young men, almost always dressed in black, low-topped caps, shaved heads. Tattoos climbed up their necks, invaded their faces, covered their entire arms. Cold, attentive gazes, as if the place didn't belong to them, but was just another territory to be marked. The gang didn't announce who they were. There was no need. Everyone knew. They didn't shout. They didn't break anything. They didn't steal openly. The method was different. Slow approach, hushed words, threats too subtle to attract attention, but sharp as blades. A warning here, a reminder there, small weekly payments, forced protection. The market was no longer breathing peacefully. That morning, Sister Margaret sensed it even before entering. Something in the air felt too heavy. As she walked through the automatic door, she noticed two of them leaning against the drinks counter, watching everyone who passed by. A third was near the checkout, pretending to choose chewing gum, but without taking his eyes off the store owner. She lowered her head and walked on. The nun wasn't the main target, not yet. The market was too small to yield large sums, but large enough to keep the machine running, and those who didn't pay learned their lesson. As she placed a simple loaf of bread in the cart, Sister Margaret heard a voice behind her, low, controlled. Sister. She turned around slowly. The man's face was partially covered in dark tattoos, symbols, numbers, aggressive lines. His eyes were young but empty. There was no explicit anger there, only dominance. Yes, my son, she replied calmly. He smiled slightly, a short, humorless smile. You come here often, don't you? Almost every day, she said. It's near the convent. The man nodded, as if that answer confirmed something important. The neighborhood is getting dangerous, he continued. Bad things happen when people don't cooperate. Sister Margaret maintained a steady gaze, not defiant, just present. There will always be danger where there is a lack of love, he replied. His smile disappeared for a moment. Love doesn't pay the bills, sister. He stepped away, leaving the phrase hanging in the air like a warning. There was no direct threat, no visible violence, but something had been set in that instant. She felt it. At the checkout, the market owner avoided eye contact. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the items. When the nun paid, he leaned in slightly and whispered, Sister, perhaps it's not safe for you to come alone. She smiled kindly. We are never alone, he replied. Outside, the sky remained grey. She paused for a moment, holding the bag to her chest. She closed her eyes for a a few seconds. Anyone watching would think it was just another silent prayer, one of those that go unnoticed. But there was something different about that instant, as if time had slowed down. Sister Margaret did not ask for protection for herself. He pleaded for mercy for those men. Across the street, leaning against a dark car, the gang members watched. One of them spat on the ground. "Just an old nun," one said. "They all pay," another replied. Sooner or later, they didn't know who she was. They didn't know where she came from. They didn't know who they were touching. And above all, they didn't know that that simple market on that quiet morning had become an observation point. Not human, not visible, but real. As the nun slowly walked away down the sidewalk, someone watched her silently, not to condemn, but to record every detail and what would come next. Nobody in that neighborhood was prepared to face it. The following days brought an eerie silence to the market. It wasn't peace, it was anticipation, that kind of quiet that precedes something inevitable, like still air before a violent storm. Employees spoke less, customers avoided lingering in the aisles, and the owner of the establishment began opening later and closing earlier, trying to pretend he still had some control over things. The gang, on the other hand, began to appear with calculated regularity, never all at once, never in the same way. Sometimes two men together, sometimes just one, always dressed in black, always with their tattoos visible, like a permanent warning etched into their skin. They walked through the market with the confidence of those who already considered themselves the owners of the place. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't need to. On Wednesday, the first payment was demanded. The market owner was called outside, into the narrow alley behind the building. There were no shouts, no visible aggression, just hushed words, and a hand casually resting in the coat pocket, where the shape of something rigid stood out. When he returned inside, he was pale, sweating profusely, his eyes fixed on the ground. From that day on, the money began to disappear. Sister Margaret noticed. She always noticed. The donation boxes for the parish were no longer there. Some basic items began to run out. The owner started responding with short, evasive phrases. Fear had taken hold. On Friday, the gang decided to take it a step further. The nun entered the market in the early afternoon, when it was quiet. She carried only a short list and a cloth bag. As soon as she crossed the threshold, she felt the stares. Two were near the cash register. A third, leaning against the ice cream freezer, watched everything in silence. She continued on her way as usual, but as she approached the bread section, she heard footsteps behind her. "Sister," said a voice different from the first time, deeper, older. She turned around. This man had his face almost entirely covered in tattoos, letters, symbols, thick lines that disfigured any trace of humanity. His eyes were dark, attentive, experienced. He wasn't a novice. He was a decision-maker. "Yes," she replied. "The market is having difficulties," he continued, feigning interest in the products. "The owner is in debt, and when someone is in debt, everyone around feels the impact." Sister Margaret understood immediately. This was no casual conversation. It was a transfer of responsibility. "I don't own this place," she said calmly, "but you help, don't you?" He inclined his head slightly. "Always buying, always talking, always praying." The tone of the word praying carried contempt. "I do what I can," she replied. The man took a step closer. The smell of tobacco and something metallic mingled in the air. "Then you can do a little more." He mentioned a value. It wasn't high. Precisely for that reason, it was dangerous. It was a test, a first lasso thrown carefully. "Every week," he added, "to keep things calm." Sister Margaret felt the weight of it fall upon her shoulders, not out of personal fear, but because she knew that kind of mechanism. She had seen it in other places, other times, other faces. She knew where it ended. "That's not right," she said, without raising her voice. The man smiled. "What keeps the doors open is right, sister." From the cash register, the owner watched the scene with restrained despair. He knew if she refused, the pressure would mount. If she accepted, she would be arrested. The nun closed her eyes for a second. "I don't have that kind of money," he replied. "And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you." The man's smile vanished completely. "Think about it," he said. "Old women tend to get hurt easily, and accidents happen." He walked away slowly, leaving the threat hanging in the air like an invisible poison. Sister Margaret paid for her purchases and left without looking back. Outside, the sun was already beginning to set. She walked a few meters and stopped. She gripped her bag tightly. Her lips moved silently. It wasn't a long prayer. It wasn't a desperate plea. It was a dialogue. That same night, the market owner received another visitor, this time at home. The message was clear. The nun had become a problem, and problems needed to be solved. What the gang didn't understand, what they still couldn't understand, was that they had chosen the wrong target, not for power nor for money, but because of who was watching everything from day one without saying a word, and because long before that simple life and that worn-out habit, Sister Margaret had learned something those men would never learn. There are forces that cannot be intimidated, and there are consequences that arrive without warning. That night, the convent seemed quieter than usual. The ancient walls creaked in the cold wind, and the narrow corridors echoed with footsteps that were no longer there. Sister Margaret sat alone in the small cell where she had slept for more than 20 years. On the simple table, a lit candle cast long, distorted shadows, like memories that insisted on returning when the world became too quiet. She was holding an object that she almost never touched, an old photograph kept at the bottom of a wooden box wrapped in a white cloth. The image was yellowed with age. It showed a younger woman, out of habit, smiling discreetly, with a boy beside her. The boy had attentive eyes, a posture too firm for his age. It wasn't a childish smile. It was the gaze of someone who observed, learned, absorbed everything. She carefully ran her thumb over the image. "It's already happening," he murmured. For years, she had believed that past would remain buried forever. She had chosen silence, distance, anonymity, not out of shame, but out of necessity. Some lives demand sacrifices that no one sees. Some choices allow no turning back. Sister Margaret was not born a nun. Decades earlier, she had lived a different life, organized, rigorous, surrounded by responsibilities that few can bear. She had been a mother in a time of fear. She had raised a son amidst threats, constant changes, false names, and perpetually locked doors. She had learned early on that protecting someone sometimes means disappearing from one's own life. When the danger finally passed, she made her choice. She joined the religious order not to escape the world, but to observe it from a different perspective, a place where no one asked questions, where silence was respected, where the past didn't matter. There, she could continue praying, not just with words, but with her presence. In the market, in the neighborhood, on the forgotten streets, she saw everything. The next morning, he returned to the market as usual. Routine was his armor. He walked through the aisles, greeted the cashier, and chose the same simple products. But something had changed. The gang members weren't there. This brought no relief. I brought warnings. The market owner approached, visibly shaken. "They came last night," she whispered. "They said that you need to cooperate or stop coming." She nodded as if she already knew. "I can't," he replied. "Sister," he lowered his voice even more. "These people don't make empty threats." She lightly touched his arm. "I know." Across the street, a dark car had been parked for hours. Inside, two men openly observed the market. One of them spoke quietly on the phone, describing every movement. "She always comes alone. She doesn't seem to have family. No security." The analysis was wrong from the start. That afternoon, Sister Margaret didn't go straight back to the convent. She walked a few more blocks and entered a small, nearly empty church. She sat in the last pew, far from the altar. She didn't light a candle. She didn't kneel immediately. She just stood there in silence. That's how he always acted when difficult decisions were approaching. "The time has come, hasn't it?" he murmured without looking up. There was no audible response, but the air around felt heavy, attentive, as if something was being recorded. Outside, the neighborhood continued its routine, oblivious to what was brewing in the shadows. The gang believed they were in control. They believed the nun was just another fragile, isolated piece, easy to manipulate. They didn't know that, elsewhere in the city, a man held one of the highest positions in the country, that his phone would ring soon, that when it rang, it wouldn't be by chance. And above all, they didn't know that this simple woman, with slow steps and a gentle voice, had spent her entire life learning to recognize the exact moment when silence ceases to be protection and becomes a warning. Their mistake wasn't the extortion, it was their persistence. And what would come next would not be immediate. It would be necessary, irreversible. Saturday dawned with a sky too clear for what was about to happen. The market opened early because of the weekend, and activity began before 8 o'clock. Families, the elderly, night workers. Everything seemed normal, and that was exactly what the gang wanted. They arrived together this time. 4 men, no disguise, black clothes, tattoos on display, synchronized steps. They didn't run. They didn't raise their voices. Their presence alone was enough to silence the place. Conversations ceased. Shopping carts stopped in the middle of the aisles. The market owner felt his stomach sink even before he saw them. room. Sister Margaret was near the cash register, sorting coins. The leader approached slowly, like someone who already knows how the scene will end. "Sister," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "we've already talked about this." She looked up. Her face remained serene, but there was something new there. Decision. "Yes," he replied. "We talked." "And you chose to ignore it," he continued, opening his arms dramatically. "That's disrespectful." Some people began to quietly move away. Nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to see. Fear is contagious. "I can't give away what isn't mine," she said. The man laughed, a short, dry laugh. "Everything here is ours now." He gestured, and one of the others pushed the nun's cart, scattering the goods across the floor. The sound of the items clinking echoed through the market like a muffled gunshot. A collective sigh ran through the room. "Kneel," he ordered. Absolute silence fell. The market owner opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't make a sound. His legs were trembling. He knew that if he intervened, things would only get worse. Sister Margaret looked around. She saw paralyzed faces. She saw fear. She saw guilt. She saw good people learning in real time the cost of silence. Then slowly she knelt down, not because they ordered them to, but because they chose to. The gesture was not one of submission. It was one of surrender. She placed her hands on the cold market floor, closed her eyes, and began to pray. Not aloud, not to be heard, but with an intensity that altered the air around her. Her lips moved silently as the men watched, confused. "Look at this," one of them mocked. "Are you going to ask for a miracle now?" The leader moved closer. "Pray loudly," he provoked, "so everyone can hear." She didn't answer, and it was at that moment that something changed. There was no light. There was no supernatural noise. There was nothing that could be recorded or explained, but there was a presence. Something or someone was there, observing every second, every breath, every intention, not to stop it immediately, but to record it, like a judge who allows the defendant to speak before sentencing. The leader felt a strange discomfort, a pressure in his chest, irritation for no reason. He took a step back without realizing it. "Get up," he said now more sharply. "That's enough." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Not yet," he replied. The word came out firmly, clear, definitive. One of the men laughed nervously. Another looked away. Something about that scene wasn't right. The humiliation had gone beyond the point of control. "Let's go," one of them murmured. "No," the leader replied. "Now she will learn." He leaned in, bringing his tattooed face close to hers. "Last chance." Sister Margaret took a deep breath. "You don't know what you're doing." He stepped away abruptly. "We know exactly what we're doing." They left the market with a final warning. They would return, and next time it wouldn't be just talk. When the door closed, the ambient sounds gradually returned. Someone started crying. The market owner slumped into a chair. Sister Margaret stood up on her own, picked up the goods from the floor, and paid again, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. That same day, in a distant building, a phone rang in a room where decisions leave no room for error. When the call was answered, there was no panic in the voice on the other end. There was clarity. And when the nun returned to the convent that night, she knelt once more, this time alone, and said only one sentence: "It's in your hands." What she didn't say aloud was simple and true. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The gang believed the neighborhood's silence was a sign of victory. For them, the lack of reaction confirmed the old rule. No one confronts those who control fear. The market remained open. The nun continued to go. No complaints, no police cars, no visible movement. That's how it always worked. That's exactly why they decided to go further. On Tuesday night, two of them followed Sister Margaret as she left the market. They didn't approach. They kept their distance, observing the slow pace of her steps, the predictable route to the convent. They recorded times, routes, lights on. They found no security, no cameras, nothing to justify concern. "She's just an old woman," one of them said. "She thinks she's protected because of her clothes." The mistake started there. The following night, four of them returned, not to talk, not to intimidate, to leave a lasting mark. The message needed to be clear enough to resonate throughout the entire neighborhood. They entered the market just before closing time. Few customers, tired employees. The owner had been expecting something like this. He'd felt it in his body for days. When he saw the men enter together, he knew there would be no negotiation. "Where's the nun?" the leader asked bluntly. "He's already gone," replied the owner, his voice trembling. The man stared at him for several long seconds. Then he smiled. "So you pay for it." There was no beating, no visible blood, just a shove hard enough to knock him behind the counter, a warning, a broken bottle, an open cash register. "Tell her that that tomorrow the conversation will be personal," the leader added. That night, someone left a symbol painted on the outside wall of the market, a message that everyone in the neighborhood knew how to interpret. When Sister Margaret found out, she showed no surprise. She woke before dawn, as usual. She put on her habit, made her bed, and knelt for a few minutes. But that morning, she didn't go straight to the market. She walked to an old telephone in the convent hallway. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. On the other end of the line, a man answered. "It's me," she said. There was a heavy silence. Then a deep breath. "Mother," he replied. She closed her eyes for a moment. They went too far. Across town, in an office where decisions shape destinies, the United States Attorney General slowly rose from his chair. His face hardened. There was no uncontrolled rage. There was something worse. Certainty. "Where are you?" he asked. "Where I've always been," she replied. "But now it's your turn to do what you were prepared to do." He hung up without saying anything else. That same night, the gang returned to the market. They wanted to put an end to it. They wanted to break the symbolic resistance of that nun, and in doing so, reaffirm their dominance over everyone. They didn't know that while they were moving, other pieces were also moving, silently, in a coordinated way, cool. They didn't know that the ultimate mistake hadn't been the threat, nor the humiliation, nor the indirect violence. The ultimate mistake was touching someone who had never been alone. And as dawn approached, and the streets seemed as empty as ever, the gang believed that control was still in their hands. But the game had already changed, and this time there would be no warning. The early morning hours brought no sirens, no noise, nothing that could alert the gang that something was different. That was the cruelest detail. Everything seemed exactly as it always had been, until it wasn't. At 5:40 in the morning, while the neighborhood was still asleep, unmarked vehicles discreetly occupied strategic points on the streets near the market. They didn't block access. They didn't turn on their lights. They just stood there, motionless, as part of the landscape. Anyone passing by wouldn't notice anything out of the ordinary. At the convent, Sister Margaret was already awake. She felt no fear. She had felt fear before, when she was young, when she carried a child in her arms and didn't know if she would make it to the next day alive. This was different. It was closure, like closing a book after reading the last page, knowing that the story has fulfilled its purpose. She drank her coffee in silence, as always. The other sisters noticed something in her expression, not sadness, not tension, but an unusual firmness. "Are you leaving early today?" one of them asked. "I'm going," he replied, "but I'll be back before nightfall." Across town, in a federal building draped in flags, the U.S. Attorney General walked down a private corridor, accompanied only by two highly trusted aides. It wasn't an impromptu operation. It wasn't emotional. It was legal, surgical, built on evidence that had been gathered for months, and which now had authorization to proceed. "No direct approach," he said. "Everything according to protocol." "Yes, sir." He paused for a moment, placed his hands on the table, and took a deep breath. "And don't touch her." At 9 in the morning, the gang entered the market for the last time, believing they still controlled the narrative. 4 men, same formation, same leader. The market owner felt his body freeze. "Where is she?" the leader asked. Before anyone could answer, the door opened again. Sister Margaret entered. The environment froze. She walked to the center of the market, placed her bag on the counter, and looked directly at the men. "That's enough," he said. The leader laughed. "Enough? Now?" "Now," she repeated. That's when the door opened once more, and then another, and another one. Men and women with visible name tags, firm voices, coordinated movements. There were no shouts. There was no running. Only clear orders, raised hands, handcuffs fastening around tattooed wrists. Federal police. Nobody is doing anything. The leader tried to react. He didn't have time. In less than 2 minutes, it was all over. The market was in absolute silence when one of the agents approached the nun with almost solemn respect. "Ma'am, we need to confirm your identity." She nodded, took an old document carefully kept out of her bag. The agent read it. He straightened his posture immediately. "Yes, ma'am." The handcuffed men began to realize that something was wrong. Very wrong. "Who is that old woman?" one of them murmured. The answer came not in words, but in presence. The Attorney General entered the market, accompanied by 2 agents. The place seemed to shrink. He walked up to the nun and stopped in front of her. For a moment, he wasn't a powerful man in the eyes of the public. He was a son in front of his mother. "It's over," he said quietly. She touched his face tenderly. "I know." The gang members stared in shock. The leader swallowed hard when he heard someone whisper, "It's his mother." At that moment they understood. There was no procedural error. There was no abuse. There was no exception. There were consequences, and as they were being led outside, they noticed something even more disturbing. No one was celebrating. There was no applause. There was no visible victory, just silence, because justice doesn't need a spectacle. And because all that time, someone had been watching everything, not to intervene too early, but to allow the truth to be fully revealed. The market remained closed that day, not by court order, but out of respect. The employees were released, the owner received medical attention, and the entire neighborhood seemed to move in slow motion, trying to understand what had just happened. The lowered metal doors reflected confused, incredulous faces. The market nun, the silent, invisible woman, had been the center of a fall that no one imagined possible. The gang members were separated right there on the street. There were no interviews. There was no press. The police cars followed different routes, as if the entire system had decided not to allow them to share even the comfort of proximity. The accusations were numerous: extortion, criminal association, witness intimidation, federal crimes. Evidence that didn't materialize that day, but was waiting for the right moment to fall into place. And now they fit together. In the federal building, the machinery turned with precision. Warrants already prepared were executed in other parts of the city. Accounts blocked, addresses searched, phones seized. What seemed like a small group revealed larger, deeper, more dangerous connections. The gang's mistake wasn't just choosing the wrong victim, it was hastening its own demise. Sister Margaret returned to the convent before nightfall, as she had promised. The other sisters greeted her with silent embraces. No one asked questions. It wasn't necessary. There was something in her gaze that said a cycle had come to an end. She knelt in the small chapel, alone. She asked for nothing. She didn't give thanks for punishments. She simply stood there in silence, like someone returning a burden they had carried for too long. "Let them learn," he murmured. That night, while the city slept, decisions were signed. There were no exceptions. There was no undue interference. The Attorney General rejected any attempt to link the case to personal gain. Everything followed the correct path, and for that very reason, it was ruthless. The following week, the market reopened. The symbol on the outside wall was erased. Conversations returned to the aisles. Fear slowly gave way. The owner put up a small sign near the cash register. "Here, no one is alone." No one commented, but everyone understood. Sister Margaret continued going to the market. Same slow steps, same old cart, same gentle smile. To an outsider, nothing had changed. But for those who knew, everything had changed. Because the story didn't end with handcuffs. It ended with revelation. The gang believed it controlled the territory. It believed it chose the rules. It believed faith was weakness. They didn't know they were being watched from day one. They didn't know that silence wasn't fear. They didn't know that justice, when it arrives, doesn't need to shout. And above all, they didn't know they had touched someone who had dedicated their entire life to protecting and waiting. The ending was shocking, not because of the noise, but because of its clarity. Because sometimes the miracle isn't escaping evil, it's seeing it fall completely.